Hey everybody, welcome to our newest segment of JAG University. Here again with Pat McBride from Comreal. If you didn't catch our last episode on, tenant, landlord situations, focusing on distributors, check it out. But today we're going to be focusing on manufacturing. We work a lot with manufacturers, as Pat does as well, and it's so specialized. I really wanted to see if we could talk a little bit about what you see as far as needs from a manufacturing tenant looking for a space, what you need in the building, things that might come up throughout that process of searching for the right spot, and just whatever comes to mind, Ben.
Yeah, so we focus solely on industrial property. We work with investors, but also, I think my favorite is to work with businesses, the actual owners, whether they're leasing a space or buying a space. That's what we do every day, and manufacturing certainly, a big part of that, whether, they're making products or they're in the aviation business. Manufacturers are, some of our favorite clients to work with, and they have very specialized needs, like you mentioned. In our market, we're so, land constrained that all the new buildings that are being built are really set up more for distribution. It's kind of your typical Class A business park, not a lot of extra parking, not a lot of heavy power in those types of properties. So they're really more set up for distribution. Not to say that those landlords don't build out those spaces for manufacturers. They do, but I think a lot of the manufacturers you see, at least in South Florida, are in older buildings. They typically have lower ceilings, but what the features that manufacturers really like is they typically have a lot of parking and they have heavy power, which are two of the main requirements for manufacturing. And then from there, it just gets really specialized depending on the very specific nature of the business.
Got it. And that's interesting too. So I see these new office parks and warehouse parks rather popping up everywhere. And they have a bunch of bays and units, so I guess, they're more catered towards distributors or freight forwarders or whatever you see there.
Yeah, it's the high ceilings, that the big door count, access right off the highways, and so they're kind of ready to go for distributors or e-commerce type users, freight forwarders.
Yeah,
manufacturers can still occupy those buildings, but typically, there's a big cost involved in making sure there's enough parking or bringing in, heavy three-phase power into the building and just kind of all the fit-up work that has to be done. We're running electrical all over the warehouse, or air compressors or fans, or just, whatever the tenant needs. There's a lot more build-out that goes into manufacturing. And in a market that's as hot as it is right now in South Florida, you even see landlords passing up on great tenants because they can lease the building with a much lesser investment to a distributor today versus putting all that money into a building and having a longer build out process to lease it to a manufacturer in 6 to 9 months from now.
Yeah, that's interesting. So just off the bat, it sounds like as a manufacturer, not only do you have a smaller selection of usable buildings and an already very limited market, but you're also maybe even seen as a less desirable tenant just because it can take a lot more work to get you set up and running, and even a possible investment from the landlord to get your space retrofitted and set up for your business.
That's 100% true. There's less potential buildings. I was on CoStar earlier, and there's, I want to say, about a little over 5,000 properties in Miami-Dade as an example, over 10,000 square feet that are industrial properties.
Yeah.
And only maybe 10% of those or so are actually used as manufacturing, or at least that's how they're classified.
Yeah.
So your pool of potential properties is drastically reduced, and we do see landlords not wanting to put that investment into their property. Now, if you are a landlord, I think there are some instances that it might be worth it, because once that manufacturing tenant is in their space, in your space, because it's so specialized, they're kind of sticky tenants. They don't like to move a lot because of the cost and the time involved. Where if you're a distribution tenant, they tend to go up and down in size more often, but it's also easier for them to move.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, you have a little bit of the con where you have the build out and all the setup and everything involved to bring in that tenant. But once they're there, I mean, them redoing that entire process somewhere else, that's very difficult.
It's a huge undertaking, and if you're in that situation as that manufacturing tenant,
yeah,
you need to start looking for space. I would say almost 2 years bore you actually have to move.
Yeah, so you don't want to move.
You don't want to move, but
okay.
I mean, sometimes you're forced to.
Yeah.
There's a new owner in the building, or you're just flat out of space.
That makes sense.
The property's no longer the right size, or you want to upgrade your facility for production reasons, or maybe you want a newer building just for the appearance, the aesthetics of it.
Yeah, and that makes sense too, because it's a difficult process to find the right space, but you also have to project your growth and how it relates to that term of that lease, or however, just because if you scale out too quickly and all of a sudden you're too big for the space, you can get caught in a position where the growth of your company is hampered by a space you're in, but you're stuck in a lease, you can't find another property, and that could prevent its own set of challenges to where you can't grow your business or can't upscale production. So that
right. I mean, some of our clients will go from one shift to two shifts, or maybe they're manufacturing 24 hours a day. But eventually there is it's a good problem to have. Growing is a great problem to have.
You just have to be ready for it.
But you have to be ready for it, and there's going to be growing pains, and the property, your real estate can be a potentially big pain point.
So, when I think being more insurance minded, a manufacturing tenant probably provides a little bit more risk towards the owner of the building as opposed to a distribution tenant, where a distributor, you're just kind of moving pallets around for the most part. But if you're doing heavy manufacturing, there's fuel sources and power and maybe some hazardous operations involved that could possibly damage a building, or that could maybe start a fire, or just really have a lot more wear and tear on the building itself. Do you tend to see tenants in the manufacturing side in more cases than not responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the building, as opposed to maybe like standard distribution tenants?
I would say, just from a landlord's point of view, they definitely want to really understand the nature of the business.
Yeah.
And like hazardous materials is always a big question. There are some landlords that, I think it's because the market is so hot at the moment, they really don't want to consider manufacturing tenants.
Yeah.
They'd prefer to just lease it, to a distributor. But there's plenty of great manufacturers out there that make great tenants, and of course they use hazardous materials. It's just kind of a process you have to go through with each landlord to make them comfortable and understand, what you're doing, and that you're regulated and safe, and you have whatever licenses that you need. And insurance, I think, is a big part of that, making sure that the tenant provides sufficient insurance to the landlord so that everyone's comfortable.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I'm interested in what you mentioned earlier about kind of like the build out and retrofitting that has to go along with the space when a manufacturer takes possession. Who generally pays for that, and how is that handled?
It's really on a deal by deal basis.
Yeah.
It's kind of what you negotiate. I would say, landlords typically don't want to invest their dollars in a tenant's like very specialized build out.
Yeah.
So, bringing like heavy 3-phase power into the building might be something they'd be willing to do because it's an upgrade to their building. But, once that power is in there, doing the fit out work or any kind of like really specialized improvements that are only specific to that tenant's business is probably something the landlord doesn't want to pay for. But that's not to say that you can't negotiate that. Maybe it is a turnkey solution with a 10 or 15 year lease to amortize all that cost into the lease. But it's really just a function of the overall deal. The credit of the tenant is hugely important into how much the landlord wants to invest, the length of the term, and just all the other considerations in the deal, the annual increases, the amount of free rent, kind of all as one package together.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, my biggest takeaways here were essentially how much more consolidated the market is for a manufacturer as opposed to other types of users of warehouse space. The fact that most new buildings aren't gearing towards manufacturers, that most landlords prefer that simpler distribution tenant where you don't have to put all the work into it and that might be a little bit less hazardous and tough on the building. The fact that there's already vacancy issues, which is further magnifies that. And then on top of it, you have the whole build out that may have to occur. You might have to bring in more power. You might have to perform a lot of retrofitting. You might have to make adjustments to the actual building that's owned by somebody else in order to get up and running. And then you have the whole possibility where that building might not even be big enough if your operation scales in a certain amount of time.
Right.
It sounds really complicated, pretty difficult.
It certainly is. A lot of manufacturing users also like to own, but in the market that we're in, it also depends on the size.
Yeah.
But even small size buildings, large, under 20,000 square feet might be the most difficult. But at the same time, I'm not sure that there's any manufacturing building over 100,000 square feet that's currently for sale in our market. So it's, leasing sounds difficult, but buying at this point might even be worse. Might even be harder.
Well, hey, I mean, it is what it is, essentially.
Right.
That's an answer I have to give a lot of time in insurance. Just kind of the options are the options. But, I mean, just one thing to keep in mind is like the first thing you said is like you got to start like 2 or 3 years in advance to really start looking ahead of time to get it done. But I love the information. It's very interesting. And as we represent a lot of building owners and manufacturing tenants themselves, I'm sure that, they'll benefit from this as well. So thank you for coming and appreciate the talk, Pat.
Thanks for having me.